So next we have Tania Hernandez, who has been involved throughout her life in women and youth human rights organizations in Mexico and human rights campaigns in Canada against violence in Mexico. And she has a doctoral degree from York University and is affiliated with the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean, or CERLAC, at York University.
Today marks the 2 weeks after the election in Mexico, and I would say that that Sunday is one of the greatest Sundays we have had in the latest or in the contemporary history of Mexico, and we have not just rested. Either because we are still so emotional about what happened, or because every new day there are news on what López Obrador and his team is doing, or the actions to be that they will take. Just last Friday, there was a meeting between López Obrador team and a delegation of Trump's administration. Just yesterday, the Pope accepted to be part of the peace forums and consultations to be held in August. And there are several announcements of the initiatives, like law initiatives regarding anti-corruption, legalization of marijuana, legalization of abortion. I said it already. So there's so much going on already. And it seems that López Obrador is now in the presidency office. Right. We haven't had yet enough time to digest and process what happened 2 Sundays ago. That great mobilization, social organization that came out from that day, and the immense majority that voted for Morena and against the traditional parties. But what happened in Mexico? That's a big question, right? Are we before a radical transformation, or are we before just are we before a transition between members of the same economic elite? Are we before spontaneous mobilizations that arose in the latest presidential campaign? Will the new government succeed in dealing with violence? Will the administration convince Trump and the people of the United States that the migration strategy shouldn't be about walls and horror? There are many, many questions up in the air, but I'm so happy that finally we are talking about how to move forward and how to get out of the mess and the insane chaos and barbarism that we lived in the last decades in Mexico. So the 1st of July was the culmination of the case of resistance, social mobilization, and political education from the 70s that firstly emerged in opposition to the single party in power, PRI. Some groups took the route of arms, like guerrillas. Others bet on their electoral route, pacific route, grassroots movements, and education. Actually, the missing students from Ayotzinapa are the heroes and active bidders of these different political traditions. The social resistance transformed as well into formal parties, such as the PRD, which is the equivalent of the NDP here, and other mercenaries as well, like the Green Party. Let's remember that PRD emerged after the huge presidential fraud in 1988, right? And holding a left platform. So the work done by the young people, women from that time up to now shouldn't be underestimated, and we have to acknowledge it. And from more recent times, the youth gathering, the Yo Soy 132 movement that emerged in the last elections in 2012, stood firm in the years after and threw their backs on corruption, fraud, injustice of the traditional particracy. And some of the leaders of that movement are now part of Morena. By this I mean that the 1st of July was in fact an anticipated result. And if we had known this result, maybe we were doing something very, very powerful, like taking the arms, I don't know. But behind these results, it's not a spontaneous social movement, but movements sustained for years and even for decades. Morena, and I agree with Colin about it, that just opened the door for them. And yes, it also opened the door to some conservative groups, like the Party of Social Encounter, Encuentro Social. But we have had conservative groups in the political scene forever in Mexico. What is new today is to have figures who have operated outside the state. For example, in community police, as is the case of Nestora Salgado, who will now have a seat in the Senate. The other example, Dr. Mireles, who was who is an ex-leader of self-defense from Michoacan. There's also the young ex-convict Carrizales, who will be a deputy, and who works with vulnerable youth. All these figures, to a certain extent, anti-systemic. And there are also the many new faces of nurses, engineers, teachers that will occupy seats in the Congress, and even be governors, like in Veracruz. The challenge now will be to reach a consensus among representatives of such diverse groups. But honestly, to have that kind of challenges is actually a gigantic step forward, because we come from a Mexico that is highly exclusionary, and where freedom of expression is a matter of life or death. Only in the Peña Nieto's administration, 40 journalists were killed. Many say that the social discontent made López Obrador the winner of this election. But I would say that this is now a more informed and organized social discontent. And here is my interpretation. The massive crime became horrifyingly normal, leaving a sense of profound injustice, and that immense injustice called for stronger action against it. The many feminicides, approximately reaching the 28,000 victims in the last 10 years, led for a more intense mobilization of women throughout the country. And perhaps that explains that in the last elections, for the first time in Mexican history, 50% of the elected Senate will be women, and 6 of them are indigenous women. In addition, half of the secretaries of state will be in charge of women as well. Half. This has no precedent. And I refuse to say that this was simply granted concessions of the system to women. Rather, I say that this is the outcome of women and feminist movement in the country. And also, the larger the violence against civils, the bigger the solidarity movement with the victims. Filmmakers, documentaries, poets, musicians, all of them have played a key role in building solidarity within and outside Mexico. The youth. Well, the youth is, in this election constituted 30% of the electoral roll, and they turned their backs on the climate of death and barbarism. In this election, the particracy, PRI-PAN, PRD, had a heart attack, and they are agonizing deeply, almost to death. Indeed, PRD has died. The left-wing party of the last 3 decades lost its registration. And it is quite symbolic that it dies exactly 30 years after its birth, and when the left finally comes to power. It is a powerful message that the left has renewed in Mexico, and that we don't want to the institutionalized left. We don't know yet what Morena will become. For now, we can say it was the canvas for underrepresented classes and sectors. Also, Mexicans have learned other ways to practice left platforms after the Zapatista movement, feminicide, drug war, social networks, and cultural change. With this backdrop, López Obrador may appear only as the most visible face of the social movements behind this election. He's a man whose life as a social and political leader intertwines with the 30 years of neoliberalism. He's also an example of resistance, of course. He saw the ascent and climax of the neoliberal economic model and questioned it from its beginning, and now he arrives at the presidency when the neoliberal beast seems to take its last breaths. So transitions or transformation. We may be at the end of a long cycle of capitalism marked by neoliberalism. I risk saying that because of that combination of historical events, social movements on the one hand, and neoliberal period, and the end of the neoliberal period on the other hand, the nature of the change in Mexico will be a hybrid one that is between transition and transformation. I call it a transition towards a transformation. This period is the bridge between neoliberalism and another capitalist era. Some say it's a return to the past, but I don't think so, because we have many new social actors who come from recent social processes with experiences and knowledge gained in the current context. I think it's a time of restructuring of elites, restructuring of the economy, and articulation of new social and political forces. It is too soon to talk about whether the transition towards transformation is a one that will take us from capitalism to something else. It will be likely a transition towards a state with political power and agency in the economic destiny of the country. It will open the door to those who neoliberalism oppressed even harder, such as indigenous population. It will be likely the foundation for a new political and economic sovereignty, the stop of the fierce violence, the building of foundations for justice and against corruption. And this is in itself too radical in a Mexico that lives one of the most savage variants of savage capitalism. The arrival of López Obrador and the movement that made it possible are likely crossing paths with a change of era worldwide. However, in this turning point contains as well new fascism, supremacism, and Trump-style fascism. It is still unclear what trend will dominate, and it's not going to be easy to hold a progressive position from Mexico. But Mexico can take a clear leadership in Latin America and the world to pose the trend towards neo-fascism. It wouldn't be the first time that Mexico becomes an important point of reference, because it happened in the 20th century when the Mexican Revolution inaugurated a series of revolutions. Now, Trump and migration. Trump is a threat to Mexico when the social and economic policy of the Mexican state expels the population as cheap labor towards the United States. In the last 30 years, with NAFTA, the Mexican state become kind of pollero state. You may be familiar with this term, the pollero state, right? But with the state policies that ameliorate or eliminate the expelling forces, Trump will be less of a threat. In this context, initiatives to the domestic economy are a key. AMLO's administration aims for policies that support agriculture, small producers, employment for the youth in rural areas, more public expenditure in education, and so on and so on. And this will help absorb the labor in the formal economy, but the results will be seen probably gradually, not immediately. Among the proposals is a strategy for food sovereignty, starting with securing sovereignty in staple foods, such as corn, beans, and others. But international food trade will not be canceled. It's going to be just selective. We can talk more about it later in the Q&A. The wide popular support that AMLO has, the coming midterm elections in the United States, give Mexico some more negotiation power in the area of migration and NAFTA. They will tell us more about it. From the campaign, it was clear that this administration will integrate Central American countries as well in the strategy about migration and free trade. Last Friday, AMLO's team handed in to Trump's delegation a development plan to deal with migration and NAFTA. This means that Mexico is setting the tone. It's not the other way around. It's not very common that Mexico proposes first a plan to the US. Normally happens out the other way, and then we receive orders. So this is setting a different tone. I would say that Trump will need more from Mexico and Canada too. Just last week, Trump and Trudeau spoke in Brussels, and they said that the new Mexican president was changing the direction of the NAFTA negotiations. And probably just with a president who has no history of corruption and has a strong commitment to food sovereignty and support to the countryside, the negotiations are not going to happen with a Mexico that easily subordinates to what the United States says. We hope so. So violence, the monster with a thousand heads. How will violence, national security, the issue of justice to the families of the disappeared be addressed? That's the big question. The demand for justice is immense, and this government receives a country with a deep wound, and this is a very complex issue. In my opinion, before amnesty, we need to know the truth, build memory, and ensure that similar events do not happen again. In this, I agree with Javier Sicilia, the journalist whose son was also killed, and soon after he led the transnational caravan, No More Blood. The formation of truth commissions will help build memory, investigate, clarify, prosecute, sanction serious violations of human rights. Then amnesty can happen, but it will be a more negotiated kind of amnesty. No? The AMLO team is committed to forming truth commissions and inviting commissioners from the United Nations. So we'll watch what happens. The militarization is necessary, of course, and our hope is that AMLO keep us with the promise of withdrawing the army from the streets gradually in the first 3 years. But the success of the withdrawal of the army will have to go hand in hand with very precise measures that address employment, investment in education, so that the youth have opportunities. So I will leave it there.